Alright folks, I'm going to get started here right away. So I'll try and project my voice because it's a long room. So today's talk will be on YouTube at some point. If you guys want to watch it again, I'm going to put a lot of information out there at you guys. And my wife was one that was talking with Veronica about what topic to do, and I'm happy to come back to do other talks if you guys would like, because I've got about a dozen. And so I had to make a choice, and seeing as how I just wrote a book and spent about a year of my life writing it, I thought I would talk a little bit about rainwater. Rainwater is super important to this region, which we can talk about in a few seconds. And I'll try and leave some room at the end so you guys can ask questions specifically about rainwater harvesting, and if there's anything else you guys want to learn about within the scope of permaculture, we can talk about that at the end today too. So I definitely recognize a lot of faces, but I'll just pretend like you guys don't know me because there's probably some people here that haven't heard of us before. So I run two companies with my wife, Verge Permaculture, which is an education company, and Adaptive Habitat, which is our engineering consulting company. And if that wasn't enough, I just took a part-time job with the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in the Green Building Department. And so I'm currently working on the third living building challenge in the world. So this is if permaculture came up with a building system or a building methodology, they would choose the living building challenge. It's probably one of the hardest building standards that you could ever possibly invent. So basically, these houses have to be net neutral water. They have to produce 105% of their electricity. They have to be net neutral in waste. They can't produce any waste as a result of being constructed. They can't have any red list chemicals in them. Red list are chemicals that are known carcinogens. The wood has to come from FCS certified wood, and on and on and on and on and on. I could spend a whole hour just talking about Living Building Challenge. And so I couldn't say no to that opportunity, and it's going to take me about a year and a half to complete that. And then also being asked to build Canada's carbon neutral building standard for residential homes, which is also turning into a really interesting project as well. So that's what I'm doing there. Adaptive Habitat mostly designs resilient homes, acres, and farms. And so people hire us to basically build what I call custom insurance policies. And so one of the talks that I was potentially going to give today was on the design of resilient homes, acres, and farms, which I can come back and give at another time. And so when I say insurance policies, we live in a very fragile world right now, and a lot of the existential risks that we face as a species are not insurable by conventional means. And so one of the ways that we can insure ourselves is by putting our money into insurance policies, or our homes, our properties, food production systems, energy production systems, water harvesting systems, so that when these disruptions come, if they come, that's the problem, is you never know if they're going to come, but you can use a probability model to basically try and understand what the repercussions of those risks coming might be. So we help our clients to analyze those risks and then make appropriate actions to be able to deal with them. And so some people might call people that would hire me preppers. I don't like that word, because we don't call people that buy insurance policies preppers. We call them pragmatic. And so there's definitely a dose-dependent amount of resilience that you can afford, or that makes sense for you to engage in. And then beyond that, it goes a bit crazy. And so we help people navigate pragmatism and craziness. And there's a fine line in between the two of those things. So that's what that company does. And then Verge, we're just doing education. And so we have a whole suite of teachers that we work with, and we deliver mostly permaculture-based education. We teach on passive solar greenhouses. We're just building a rainwater harvesting course right now, and land design. And so those all kind of fit together in this kind of strange thing. And what we realized almost 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, both my wife and I were working in the petroleum industry, and we started learning about all these things like peak oil and climate change and peak phosphorus, peak water, pretty much peak everything. And the people we were working with were in complete denial about any of these things. It doesn't matter if you don't believe in one or the other of them. There's so many problems that we're up against right now. And the response was always just more oil, more gas. That's the answer. And the more conversations I started having with people, it didn't really matter when any of these peaks were going to happen. If you're a young adult and you're planning on having children, then you start thinking about beyond your lifetime. And so the people that I was talking to peak oil about, for example, would say, well, it doesn't really matter. It's probably 50 years away. It's like, well, I'm only 25 or 26 years old. That's still in my lifetime. It's definitely going to be in my kid's lifetime. Why does it matter if it's 50 years? It's taken us 100 years to get here. We're talking about reinventing the entire world, automotive, our housing industry, the way that we make living, basically. Like, it's going to take us 50 years to make that transition. Why are we putting our blinders on? And the reason is because we get enormous amounts of money extracting this resource. And the thing is that I couldn't criticize the industry because I use it in my car and I heat my house with it. And so I was stuck in this situation where I was having these difficult conversations with people in the industry, but at the same time, bringing it to market, and I was one of the consumers in that market. And so going around with nasty signs, being an activist against the petroleum industry was a maladapted approach to dealing with a hyper-complex issue. And so I ended up getting a 5-minute video in my inbox one day called Greening the Desert of this guy who took this meaningless piece of earth, the bottom, lowest place on earth, hypersaline soils, maybe 10 inches of rain in 2 rain events, so 200 to 250 mils of rain in 2 rain events per year at best. And he turned it into this self-regenerating ecosystem. And his name's Geoff Lawton, and he ended up being an instructor of mine. And so my wife and I quit our jobs and traveled around the world to try and understand whether or not the myth that we tell ourselves in this province was the only myth that existed in the world. And it turns out it's not. And that we are deeply embedded in this mythology, that the only way that we can exist in this province is through the extractive industry of oil and gas. Now, I think oil and gas is an incredible resource, and we should not stop extracting it. But we should use it for things other than driving cars and use it for more tangible things like plastics and things that are going to last longer than just one combustion cycle or one piston movement. But that's another story. And so as we travel around the world, we realize that every culture has their own constraints. So Denmark didn't have the oil and gas resources that we did, and so they developed the wind turbine industry, literally, out of need to find another way to produce energy. And so as we come up against constraints, humans create opportunities and new ways of doing things. And because we have a plethora of this energy called fossil fuel, we are just extracting it as fast as we possibly can. And I think that's also a maladapted approach, because we should be actually doing something closer to what Norway does and trying to extend the length of the resource out for 3, 4, 5, 600 years, as opposed to getting out of the ground in 10 or 15. Now, one of the next peak situations that we're going to find ourselves, especially in this region, in a very short period of time, is water. So all of these things have started coming to the fore now. Did you guys know that at current rates, the glaciers that we all depend on to fill rivers like the Sheep, the Bow, the North Saskatchewan, basically the Columbia Glacier is going to be gone by 2030. 2030. Okay, that glacier feeds 50% of the river flow in southern Alberta. We are not immune to that. That's an enormous amount of water that once it's in its sink, it's not going to come back very easily. Now, there are some people that are saying that we're heading back into a cooling, which could see the glaciers grow again, but that's to be determined. The risk of the glaciers being gone in 2030, which seems to be more probabilistic than them growing because we're observing them shrink right now, means that southern Alberta, Edmonton basically south, is in deep shit, literally. And so another statistic that you might find interesting is that 80% of the water in this province is north of Edmonton, 80% of the population is south of Edmonton. Huge discrepancy there. And so we've got enormous water constraints. But what's really interesting is as you travel around the world, what you realize is that we're water heathens. We use incredible amounts of water here. And the reason that we use incredible amounts of water is because we don't come up against those hard constraints, or our politicians aren't forcing us to use less. And because it comes out of a tap and there's no real feedback mechanism, people don't really have a sense that there is any kind of scarcity at all. So there's this mentality that if you're at a talk like the one today that you guys all have or that you've all thought about but probably have never put words to, it's on Facebook, it's in the newspaper, it's on the radio, it's in podcasts. You're obviously environmentally conscious people to show up to a talk like this. And so the saying that you're thinking in your head right now, or potentially have had other people insinuate in conversations that you've had with them, is that humans are inherently destructive. Okay? And what I've come to realize is that this is completely false. This is another one of these myths that exists within the ecosphere, or communities of ecologically minded individuals. Humans are not inherently destructive. We just got the design wrong. And what's really interesting is that you can go, I just came back from a sailing trip. I was sailing for 3 weeks in the Baja. My dad fixed up an old sailboat, and when you're on a sailboat, everything is based on feedback mechanisms. Okay, you've got a limited amount of water, you've got a limited amount of food, and you've got a limited amount of diesel. And it's interesting because sailors are very interesting people. They tend to, especially in the Baja, they tend to be from Canada or from the United States. They live here through the summer on their land-based homes, either in cities or on acreages, where there's no apparent limits. And they just go crazy. They just use as much as they want. And then the minute that they get onto a sailboat, all their behaviors change. And all of a sudden, they become conservative. They're careful about what food they eat, how much, especially if you're going to go from, let's say, the Baja to Vancouver, you're 500 miles offshore for 6 weeks. Every drop counts of water, every drop of diesel counts, every ounce of food counts. And you've got to be conscientious about how you're using that. And that person is the same person that when they come back to land has no apparent conscientiousness around what they're using, because it seems like there's an unlimited resource. So the difference is that on a sailboat you've got feedback, you've got meters, you've got gauges. You can actually determine how much you've got in your tank, and you judge your behavior based on what's available. But when you see giant glaciers, or when you turn a light switch on and off and you can't see the repercussions of using that power, there's no feedback in the system, and so there's no ability for most people to have a behavioral change. And so the only way that we've been trying to actually create behavioral change to move humanity towards where we actually need to be, to have 7 billion people on this planet, is through guilt and fear and regulation. And my argument is that the better approach is to actually get architects and engineers and individuals to design systems with tight feedback mechanisms. Because when I put a rainwater system onto somebody's house, or a solar array onto their roof, or a septic tank into their backyard, most people will look at how much water is left in the tank, and they will adjust their consumption accordingly. Most people will try and game their solar array to reduce the amount of power they're consuming so that they're sending more back to the grid. Most people will stop putting toxic chemicals, if they're properly educated, down their septic system, because they know that those chemicals are going onto their property. So the solution is not fear and guilt. It's actually just tight feedback mechanisms and teaching people how to design better. And so today I want to talk about rainwater, because we actually don't need to consume 250 liters of water per person per day, which is the average in Calgary, and it's probably close out here. We can live on far less, and the best way to live on far less is actually to encourage people to harvest the resources that are coming off of their own properties and putting them to productive use right where they are. When we were in Australia, which is one of the places that we traveled to, what we recognized was not only were we traveling around Australia, we were actually living on rainwater. Everywhere we went, that was the adaptation in Australia. If you want to live on the driest place on earth, or one of them, you drink rain. because there is no groundwater. And that's what they did 150 years ago when they were brought to the continent. They started drinking rainwater because that was the only way they could coexist on that landscape. And so it's part of the culture. People don't have a phobia of rainwater. They embrace it. And in fact, what we found when we were writing this book, I didn't know these statistics until recently, 6 million people every single day in Australia are using rainwater. 3 million of those people are drinking rainwater without end-of-line treatment. Filters, chlorination, UV light, and they're not dying. And in fact, when you look at the research, it turns out that more people, it's only slightly statistically relevant, but more people typically get sick on mains water than they do on rainwater, which is really interesting because that's not the way that the regulators are coming at the rainwater situation. Now, when we started writing this book, rainwater in this province was the statement from the government was you can use it for toilet flushing and subsurface irrigation, and that was it. And we didn't really know how the government was going to go with the rainwater regulation. We had some clues because there was a draft standard out, but the guy that was basically building the draft standard, who was pretty high up in Alberta municipal affairs, ended up getting cancer and suddenly dying. And there were some mysterious things that happened with his computer. It randomly disappeared with all of his information. They think there was some other stuff going on there. And all of a sudden, the standard development just disappeared for a while. And then recently, it's actually been enacted, and it's the first standard of its kind to actually be a cooperation between the United States and America. So it's a CSA NSF standard, meaning that it's applicable in both countries, which is unbelievable. It's never happened. And it's actually a really good code. I'm actually really happy about it. But when we were writing this book, we didn't know where it was going to go. And also, we wrote the book because in a way that was going to be relevant to anybody in the world. So trying to understand how to write this to be applicable for the code and also relevant throughout the world was a really difficult challenge. And it took us a long time to figure out how to build the book. Especially as engineers, we're actually an extension of the regulatory body in a way because we have to protect public safety. And so what we did was we said, well, let's look at the largest case study in the world in terms of what best practices are when it comes to rainwater. And it turns out it's Australia. And so we started digging into the research. And what's really interesting about the Australian example is that they started drinking rainwater before they had the science to understand why they could drink rainwater. And so it's an incredible empirical situation to be able to observe. And only in the last 30 years has the science actually caught up to the empiricism, which is kind of interesting. And it couldn't come at a better time because with regards to the way that regulations are going, this case study is really important and will help inform, I think it'll help inform regulators how to actually allow and empower citizens to take responsibility for their own water supply, which is the only way that it's going to work in this province, even in southern Saskatchewan, if we want to actually have human habitat coexisting beyond where water is going to go. We're going to have 50% less water potentially within 10 years. That's nuts. Completely crazy. And so we've been harvesting rainwater off our own property for many years and mostly just using it for irrigation. We haven't brought it into the house just because I did some experiments early on where I was harvesting gray water and I ended up getting caught and I just made the decision early on not to be an activist around rainwater as well. I want to get another court order. So we've been using it in our gardens successfully. We've got a lot of experience with harvesting rainwater from our time in Australia and in Jordan and all around the world. And basically over the last 10 years we've been retrofitting this bungalow to where it is right now. And I would say that the project's mostly complete now and we're actually getting ready to move on to our next project. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this book was to kind of highlight some of the stuff that we've done and represent the best practices going forward. These are the same kids that are playing plus plus back there, so they've kind of come along the journey with us as we've gone. Epidemiological health surveys confirm that household rainwater systems provide similar public health outcomes to municipal water supplies. That's the most important point. We don't have to just rely on a centralized system. We can create these type feedback mechanisms and provide a secondary source of water. Water is like literally central to life. You cannot do anything without it, yet we treat it like it's never going to end. And what's crazy, I mean, you guys in Black Diamond here in Turner Valley went through that flood, and we're basically on water alert for how many years? 5 years? Is it still on right now? Still on, right. And so Calgary, during that same flood, we came within hours of basically having to evacuate the entire city because it almost had to shut down the entire water system. In spite of the fact, think about the irony of this, we had the most amount of rainwater that we had ever had in a really short period of time. What's that poem? Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. And so NASA has this great saying that every system that's critical should have a resilient backup. NASA says 1 is 0 and 2 is 1. So one system is equivalent to 0 systems, because if it breaks, you're done, especially in space. 2 systems is equivalent to 1 system, because you've now got a resilient supply. All of our systems that are we're hyper dependent on food, energy, and water should not be singular sources. This is I could do a whole 1-hour talk just on natural gas and electricity. Every single one of our houses requires both of those fuel supplies in order to stay warm, in spite of the fact that we go below -40 here, or -30. So water is no different, and the solution to the fragility of the water system is to allow people to have decentralized supplies. And up until this code, a lot of the best practices which have been brought forth by organizations like ARCSA in the United States, the American Rainwater Catchment Association, have been onerous at best. And especially when you start looking into the research, these systems don't have to be expensive and they don't have to be complex. A lot of the kind of best practices that they've proposed have really focused on what we're going to call end-of-line treatment. And by the end of this talk, you'll realize that you cannot just put filters on the back end of a poorly designed rainwater harvesting system and walk away from it. Okay? And so if you read some of the other best practices, you'll get the sense that the solution to quality drinking water comes from basically just slapping a few filters on the back of the system. You've got to get the other stuff right first. We're going to talk about that now. So with good design and sensible maintenance practices, roof harvested rainwater will be clear, have little taste or smell, and will be of good quality without the need of disinfection or sterilization. This is not what the code says. Okay? This is just what the research says. So if you're forced to put on filtration and sterilization because you want to drink it, you might need to do this just for code purposes, but you can know that you can trust that your rainwater is clean inside of the tank. There are a small number of situations where poor design, inadequate maintenance, and lack of understanding led to human illness. So as a result of, Australia is kind of in this weird place right now where they're trying to encourage the use of mains water. They're trying to move to a centralized system, but the people down there are resisting it. And so in order to try and encourage that, some of the corporate water lobbies essentially went around and cherry-picked specific rainwater systems, literally stirred the barrel up and took samples and then published the results of that water. So there's this huge battle going on in Australia right now where the decentralized guys are basically the centralized guys are trying to call out the decentralized guys, but the decentralized guys are basically saying, well, no, you're not testing the water appropriately, and in fact, your systems are killing more than decentralized systems. So this is really interesting power play. Meanwhile, we're moving in the other direction where we're moving from centralized systems and recognizing the power of decentralized systems. I'm not going to read this, but this is just a small sampling of the research that we dug into to try and understand the science of rainwater harvesting. And you can get all of these papers for free on our website, and I'll give you a link to that at the end if you want to actually dig into the data yourself. So we're going to talk about something called the anatomy of a rain system, and I'm going to go through all of the different components in here, and by the end you're going to realize that this is ridiculously simple, but I'll try and bring some of the science in so you can understand why we do what we do and how to set up your system for success on your own property. And by no means am I standing here telling you that you should harvest your own rainwater and drink it if you don't want to. But let's look at it from an asymmetry perspective. Let's say that you do go to the little bit of extra effort to set up a proper system on the front end, and you guys have another 1 in 100 year flood, which by the way some scientists were saying was a 1 in 50 year flood. Just keep that in mind. And all of a sudden you lose your treatment plant again here, but you know that you've done your due diligence and you've built a system that is capable of potable consumption. That's a great situation to be in. That's a nice little insurance policy that doesn't cost very much to have set up on your property. And as you'll see, it's a lot simpler than you might think. So there's basically, we're going to talk about the next few slides, we're going to talk about collection, pre-filtration, conveyance, and storage, and the best practices associated with that in order to set up a successful rainwater system. So collection is basically your roof, and hopefully it makes sense that you should have a roof that has the least toxic materials involved in it. I always get the question, can I harvest off of a tar shingle roof? The problem is actually not the tar or the bitumen. The problem with a lot of those shingles is that the shingles themselves are embedded with fungicides. Okay, so if you're harvesting water with fungicide in it, and you're using it to irrigate your garden, it's going to end up in your garden, right? And so I love it. I love the ahas that we just had right here. Those ahas probably were all around. It's the same thing that I get when people say, well, why would I harvest the water off of my driveway if there's oil on my driveway? It's like, well, because the minute you start harvesting the water off your driveway, you're going to make sure there's no oil on your driveway. You're going to fix your car. So it's a feedback mechanism again, right? And so if you know you're going to harvest the water off your roof, you might choose a different roofing material. And maybe we could just make that roofing material obsolete, because it doesn't matter if it ends up in your garden or it ends up in the Sheep River. It's ending up somewhere. The difference between the Sheep River and your garden is it's personal. You've got to deal with it yourself. So we want to choose materials that are the least toxic. As we'll see here shortly, the systems are actually very resilient for reasons that were not apparent 100 years ago that are very apparent right now. So we'll talk about how toxicity is dealt with in the rainwater harvesting ecosystem. We want to enhance sterilization factors, reduce contamination vectors, slope the gutters to properly drain, and then maintenance is basically keeping your roof clean of debris and pruning overhead vegetation. So let's go into these a little bit more. It turns out that when we think about a treatment train in a rainwater harvesting system, what we mostly think about is filtration. Okay? But it turns out that every stage from where the drop actually hits the roof to when it comes out of the tap represents part of the filtration or treatment train system. And you cannot separate any one component in that system. Every part of that system actually plays a role in cleaning up the rainwater. So on the roof, removing the trees around your roof and allowing UV to hit it is going to sterilize the roof. UV light is an incredible sterilant. And removing the branches from the roof is going to prevent the organic matter from falling on it, and it's also going to prevent birds from crapping on your roof, which actually turns out is not really even a big deal. But it's still best practices to keep the birds off and keep the trees vegetated. The tree vegetation, the biggest problem that we have with it is it clogs up the gutters, which prevents it from getting into the rain tank. Turns out, and I'm not going to encourage you to do this, but it turns out that a gutter full of leaves and organic matter acts as a biofilter and will actually produce cleaner rainwater than if you keep your gutters clean. One of the other problems that happens when you have standing debris in your gutters is that it can get wet. It usually does stay wet, and it will actually cause galvanic action and will eat through your gutters. So it's more about keeping your gutters for longer periods of time than it is about worrying too much about the organic matter getting into your rain tank. So we want to slope our gutters properly so that we have good conveyance, especially here. We get really intense rain events. We get a few really intense rain events. We want to make sure we capture every drop, which means proper sloping. People don't like to slope their gutters because it makes their house look like it's not square. But you have to, there are ways to do it to minimize that effect so that it doesn't look like you have a house built from Dr. Seuss. So throughout the book, we've got this image, and this image is also on our website. We've got an infographic you can download for free as well with this image on it. And so pre-filtration is the next piece. And actually, in our climate, we actually want to have this diversion valve. So in the winter time, especially for an above-grade tank, we actually just send the water out to a rain garden or someplace on our landscape. In the summertime, we flip that over and send it into what's called a rain head. So pre-filtration is literally just a screen on a 45-degree angle with a basket underneath it, and it keeps all of the debris out of the tank. They're really tiny little holes, and then underneath it we've got a first flush diverter. Turns out these aren't needed. Okay? They're actually a waste of time and money. They do work a little bit, but the problem is that most people don't do the maintenance on them, and so you end up with a pipe full of septic effluent, essentially. So a little ball sits in here. The first flush of water that comes off of the roof ends up in this pipe right here. And then as soon as the pipe fills up, all subsequent water flows into the tank. And so the idea is that the dirtiest water ends up in that pipe. And there's a small little hole at the bottom here that allows the water to drip out into your rain garden. And so at the end of the rain event, this ball comes back down to the bottom, resets, and can be used again. I don't even put these on my systems anymore because the data doesn't support that they actually do anything. So why waste your time and money? And if you don't maintain it, it's actually going to make your rainwater worse. So just skip that step. I have it in here so we can talk about it though, because everybody thinks they need first flush diverters. And I've been teaching people to use first flush diverters for 10 years. And as a result of all the research that I did, I'm not using them anymore. The water, we'll go to the next part here, so that's pre-filtration, and so we want to include a pre-filtration strategy in your design. This is the most important thing in the entire system. Okay, that screen. They're about 50 to 60 bucks. They'll last for the life of your rainwater harvesting system, and they do more than pretty much everything else. The other thing that they do is they keep mosquitoes out of the system. You want to place equipment in a location easy to access and inspect. So make sure that when you're walking around the house that you can see this screen. They're very easy to clean. They're mostly self-cleaning, but every once in a while you have to pull the screen off and clean it yourself. You want to check and clean screens on the basket on a regular basis. Repair the screens as required, and check the first flush diverter regularly and clean out the drainage ports as required. That's assuming you've got a first flush diverter. Okay, so the conveyance piping. So we want to place PVC piping protected from direct sunlight. So if you do have PVC piping in direct sunlight, you want to paint it. PVC is not UV stable. So you actually want to coat the piping or use a different material. Generally speaking, we want to have dry systems. So what that means is that all the piping is on a bit of an angle, so at the end of a rain event, the water will leave the pipe and the pipe is dry. There are actually versions of systems called wet systems. We're not going to generally use them too much up here because the pipes will freeze through the winter time. You want to check, again, clean screens and basket filters, repair screens as required, and check the first flush diverter well as part of that. Just quickly, that's what a wet system is. So essentially, the pipe remains full all the time, and in rain events, it'll just push the water into the tank. But this water down here will, any kind of material in there, any kind of dirt is going to settle out in that pipe. So you got to clean it on a regular basis, and you've got to be able to empty it in the wintertime. Versus a dry system where we have slope and the water will leave. This was probably the most interesting part of writing the book, and it just completely blew my mind. And whenever I find stories like this, it gives me incredible hope for the future. So there's this thing in the world that microbiologists are very familiar with that most people are not aware of, called microbial infallibility. Has anybody heard of that here? So microbial infallibility is this idea that there has never been a place on Earth that they have not found microbes, including nuclear fuel rods. Okay, so microbes have the ability to exist in any environment. They're probably in space too. And most of the time when these microbes are hanging out there, they're usually doing something good. And so what it turns out, the Romans actually knew this, but they didn't know what the mechanism was. The Romans knew, if you look at the literature about Roman civilization, because they were big rainwater harvesters, they knew that water stored in tanks would improve over time, that it would purify. But they had no idea what the mechanism was. But now we know. So if you look back at this tank, we have this diversion system down here. You don't have to have two, you can usually get away with one. But what we're doing there is we're actually creating a quiet inlet. We're trying to move the water very gently when new rainwater is coming in and trying not to disturb the sludge layer. A lot of the old literature talks about getting into these tanks and scrubbing them with chlorine and removing the sludge layer, and now we've found that is absolutely not what we should be doing. We want to not touch the sludge layer, and we do not want to scrub our tanks. It turns out that they did a whole bunch of tests. Dr. Coombs did a whole bunch of tests in Australia where they looked at the center water column, and then they looked at the biofilms, the microbes that were forming on the outside of the tank, as well as the sludge layer on the bottom of the tank. This is the part that blew my mind. When they did a screening of heavy metals in the water, arsenic, lead, cadmium, nickel, zinc, aluminum, like all the metals that you don't necessarily want in any kind of high concentration in your body, they found that the one that comes to mind is lead. They found lead in concentrations of 300,000 times in the sludge when compared to the center water column. That's like, bam, huge, unbelievable. Basically what's happening is rainwater has very little nutrient in it. It's a liquid that very little can grow in because there's no nitrogen, phosphorus. There's a little bit of nitrogen, but not a lot. And so you start putting water into a system where there's all these microbes and they're very hungry because it's a nutrient-less environment, and they will basically consume whatever they can. And so the biofilms start to suck out all of the toxins in the water all on their own within like a 2-week period of time, and they will clean the water out. And so the sludge layer and the biofilm layer are things that we want to protect and enhance as opposed to eliminate and try and kill. It turns out when they looked at systems where they were rainwater harvesting, and then in the dry season they would fill the tanks back up with mains water that had chlorine in them, it would compromise the biofilms, and the effect would be diminished. So we actually want to encourage microbial life in our tanks, and the way that we do that is not disturbing the sludge layer and not allowing sterilants into the system itself, and then ensuring that the water, when it does come in, doesn't stir the tank up an enormous amount. So really, really hopeful stuff. The other interesting thing that came out was they looked at children drinking rainwater, and it turned out that there was a slight statistical increase in sickness in children that drank mains water versus rainwater. Why might that be? Because we're 99.9% non-human. Okay? All the research on the gut microbiome is coming out now, and we're more genetically of microbes than we are of human DNA. And so when we drink chlorine, we're actually detrimentally affecting our microbiome. And so rainwater is a probiotic. Unbelievable. So we want to minimize disturbance by keeping minimum water levels in the tank. So our outlet, you'll notice that our outlet to our hose bib or to our pump is above our inlet. We always are minimizing the turbulence in the bottom of the tank. We want to de-energize water with an inlet piping configuration or inlet screen, so either a screen at the top that creates a rain shower or these upturned inlets in the bottom of the tank. We want to place an inlet and outlet reasonably far from each other, so these should be far apart from each other as possible. We want to use larger tanks versus smaller ones. The best thing about 50-gallon rain drums is that they're a gateway drug to bigger rain tanks. It's amazing how often people put them in, they're like, it was full in like 3 minutes. And it's like, yes, so you need to get a bigger tank now. Those 50-gallon drums are completely insufficient for any kind of meaningful rainwater harvesting. So use them for something else, like compost tea, not for harvesting rainwater. We want to use larger, keep the intake 4 to 6 inches above the sludge layer. So again, always keeping the bottom of this system in water and not disturbing the sludge layer on the bottom. So avoid unnecessary sterilization, chlorination, or desludging of your tank. What's crazy, even the biofilms, they produce polysaccharides, which are sticky sugars, and they've even found bugs and insects being stuck to the wall. So they're actually cleaning out particulate as well as the water-soluble contaminants. Check and clean any tank inlet or outlet filters on a regular basis. Repair screen as required. Perform a visual maintenance on both externally and internally, and check for structural integrity to make repairs as required. So very simple. You'll notice that on this picture, this is a floating inlet. And so the cleanest water is actually in the center water column. And so as the water level comes down, this will come down proportionally and always stay in the center water column, which is where the cleanest water is. It's not if you don't do this, it's not like you're going to die. It's just this is one thing that you can do to improve it a little bit more. So the last thing that came out of all the research was that the water mains companies that were trying to discredit rainwater harvesting were taking rainwater from the tank and testing it, which is not fair because when you're testing mains water, where do you test it from? The tap. So it turns out there's a whole bunch of additional treatment that happens from the tank to the tap as well. And so it's not a fair comparison. We're not doing science if we're cherry picking data from a tank and not allowing it to go through the plumbing system. So biofilms exist in these lines, and there's a couple of other things that happen. So there's absolutely going to be spores in the water, fungal spores. But what happens when you've got fungal spores and you've got microbes that are in an aqueous solution, they stay viable. Okay? So spores, when they're dry, are not viable, and they're waiting for the right moisture content in order to become viable so that they can do what they need to do. But when you have spores and microbes in an aqueous solution, they're all viable, they're alive. They're waiting for food, essentially, to do their thing. And so when we run it through, the first thing we do is run it through a very coarse filter. This is mostly to protect the pump, but it also takes some of these larger particles out. This won't necessarily filter out spores. In fact, it definitely won't. And so one of the first things that it comes across in terms of part of that treatment train is the sudden pressure change. Okay, that's going to have an effect. It's going to kill some of the microbes as we instantaneously increase the amount of pressure in the system. The next thing, if it goes into a hot water system, that's going to occur is something called Tyndallization. And so Tyndallization is essentially a thermal shock. And because the spores and the microbes are viable, putting them into a sudden thermal shock is going to kill them. So anything coming out of your shower, especially if you're keeping your tank hot enough, 80 degrees Celsius, that'll deal with Legionnaires and any of the other potential issues that might be in that water. All subsequent drinking water goes through a very simple 0.2 micron ceramic filter, which will take care of everything except for viruses. And the only viruses that we're really susceptible to are viruses from higher order mammals. So as long as you don't have humans or cows shitting on your roof, you're good. The code is going to require you to put in a UV light, which is what they're calling a second barrier. So it's 2 barriers. Barrier number 1, barrier number 2. There are filters, ultra filters that will go down to, I think it's 0.1 micron, which will actually capture viruses as well. Those are available in Australia. They will come to Canada eventually. But anyways, put a UV light in here. And then because we live in an agricultural province, the one thing that I think is really important to do is make sure you have a carbon filter to deal with SOCs and VOCs. So Roundup, herbicides, pesticides, and anything else that's being sprayed out there in aerosol form that's going to end up on your roof. Those things are still ending up in your municipal water source. It's not just rainwater. So you should have carbon filters on your water as well if you don't want to be drinking that stuff. And keep in mind, like, people don't realize this, Roundup is actually not patented as a herbicide, it's patented as an antibiotic. It just happened to kill plants, which is why it's being used the way that it is right now. If you want to look into Roundup, check out Dr. Zach Bush on YouTube. It will scare the crap out of you, but it will also inform you on how to manage the toxicity. Roundup is going to make DDT look like child's play. It's just coming out of the wash now. All of our pesticides are hormone disruptors. Think about that. Hormones operate at parts per billion in our bodies. We're eating plants that have been sprayed with hormone disruptors. Okay, and that's in our water. They found Roundup in every. They did a test on pregnant women. One group ate all organic food, one group ate non-organic food. Both sets had Roundup in their breast milk. It's everywhere. So do your research. It doesn't matter whether it's rainwater or it's even ending up in the groundwater. Denmark banned Roundup because they found it in groundwater. The stuff is not decomposed in 3 years. So make sure you put a carbon filter on your water source. Get rid of your chlorine. Get rid of all the volatile organic chemicals and synthetic organic chemicals. So rainwater storages are balanced ecosystems in the same way that the environmental ecosystems improve rainwater, regular water. And so in some ways, allowing our water to sit in this treatment train is actually making better water for us, if you do it properly, than what you're getting out of the mains water. If you talk to people that manage city water systems, they're constantly fighting biofilms. It's their nemesis, because biofilms reduce the efficacy of chlorine. And so a properly designed rainwater system should theoretically produce better quality water than mains water, if it's done properly. Good upfront design and sensible proactive maintenance of your systems are the fundamental thing that will impact the end-use water quality. So you cannot make up for bad design with filters. You've got to get the design piece right, and as you can see, it's not that hard. It's pretty simple. A fit-for-purpose rainwater harvesting system that includes good design and sensible maintenance will contribute far more to assuring water quality than prescriptive end-of-line treatment, and you must meet the legal requirements mandatory by your local jurisdiction. So, I encourage you guys to write this URL down. You can get all the research that I quoted today there. We've documented it all, so you can download it and read it for yourself. We've got video interviews with Dr. Coombs. One of the things that we were really frustrated with, as engineers, we're really good with spreadsheets, and so when somebody asks me to design a rain tank, I just use my spreadsheet, and I look at the curves, and I find the optimal. But unless you're trained in how to look at mathematical equations like that, it's not super intuitive for most people. So when we looked at the literature for algorithms to basically optimize tank size, which is the most expensive component of a rainwater harvesting system in Alberta because of how cold it is, even the most expensive $200–300 textbooks that we ended up purchasing to do our literature review said that rainwater harvesting optimization tools are proprietary knowledge, and therefore you have to hire engineers and architects in order to do it. And we said, screw that. So we actually built our own algorithm, and you can download it for free here, or you can download a pro version of it that runs in Excel and it's beautiful, and for $25 on our website. And you'll save it by the first rain tank that you design with the $25, more than save it. The tool has all the rainwater harvesting data for all of North America, and it runs you through a process to be able to design the smallest tank possible to meet your objectives. So you're basically minimizing your cost and maximizing the potential to hold rain, depending on whether your goals are for irrigation, drinking, or whatever. You have to set your own goals. I should say that the book itself actually has the same algorithm. If you're an Excel nerd, you can build it yourself. So I've given it away for free in there. But if you don't want to type all the cells out, you can pay us 25 bucks for that thing. I do have books for sale up here, and they're $10 less than Amazon if you're interested in getting into rainwater harvesting. I'd love to sell you a copy if you're interested. And I've got some time for questions if there are any regarding anything that we've talked about today. Yep, so the question was, does a Berkey filter do the same thing? Absolutely. So Berkey filter, you're always pouring water back in, and that's great. There's lots of feedback there. I think they're fantastic. They're great in emergency situations. They'll also deal with more than just SFCs and VOCs. I think they will have to take on heavy metals as well. Putting in a carbon filter in your house is very inexpensive. You're talking about 100 bucks for the canister and probably 20 or 30 bucks for each filter, plus some plumbing. So if you own your own house, the other thing to think about with chlorine, chlorine is the largest contributor to indoor air quality issues. So when you're showering, that hot water is vaporizing chlorine gas. It's the same thing they made mustard gas out of. When you flush your toilet, that chlorine gas ends up in the air, and you're breathing it in. So when you put a whole house carbon filter on, you're eliminating the chlorine. Now, I don't know if Black Diamond uses chlorine or chloramine. And how you take chloramine out is a whole other ball of wax. Chloramine is ammonia and chlorine together. And you can Google that, and you can go down that rabbit hole on your own. In terms, what's that?
It's nasty.
It's nasty, yeah. You don't want it in your body, and the problem with chloramine is you can't smell it. It's odorless. So your municipality will...
They would use chlorine here then.
You can smell it. Okay, that's good. Chlorine is actually better because you can remove it. Yeah. So the question was, what about snow harvesting? So it turns out in our ecosystem that about a fourth of the water comes in the form of frozen precipitation. So if your tank is below grade and your downspouts are dark colored and facing the sun, you can successfully harvest some of that water. If you've ever wondered why downspouts have got ribs in it, the ribs are there so that they can expand and contract with the ice. If you use plastic and it gets plugged up, it'll crack. And so you can do that. There's a chance always that you've probably all seen downspouts that get frozen with water. And so Mike Reynolds from the Earthships, what he does, he puts a few extra solar panels on his roof, and he just runs some heat trace. And so he collects enough solar energy to basically melt those systems so that you can harvest in the. But if you live on a larger property, even if you live on a small property, one thing I want to impart with you, the problem with this book is we were limited to 50,000 words. I could talk about water harvesting in the larger context for 72 hours. I teach a course on it, called the Permaculture Design course. But we are so lucky to have snow here. Okay? And there's lots of reasons for that. If you've ever flown, I was just flying down to the desert not that long ago, and you fly over the Sierra Nevadas, and what's really cool about this community, and I think this is going to play a super big role as the climate shifts going forward, is that you guys are on the lee side of a mountain, so you have orographic effects. Any climate that has access to snow has the ability to make rain, because snow blows around in the wintertime. So the smart people who are setting up their properties correctly for resilience are going to set up snow fences, shelter belts. I mean, even barbed wire will harvest rainwater when it comes to snow, because a barbed wire fence will always have more snow on the lee side than on the other side. So you can't do that in the tropics. You cannot make your property rain more, but you can here. We can double, triple, quadruple the amount of water on our properties just by setting up the right depressurization systems. That's all a shelter belt is, that's all a fence is, that's all a house is, in the right locations. And then we look for opportunities to store water in the ground, either in ponds, rain gardens, swales. There's all sorts of different water harvesting features that you can.
So if you have an asphalt shingle, you wouldn't recommend using that water for your garden?
I would do a little bit of due diligence to see go back to the manufacturer if you can look underneath it and see who made it. And I would actually recommend that you do harvest the rainwater and that you treat it on your property before letting it go out to the Sheep River. And I've been harvesting water off. I don't own my own house. I live with my mother-in-law, and we have a tar shingle roof. And I've seen no detrimental effects in my garden. But my preference would be basically roof surfaces. The roof surfaces that are recommended are clay, concrete, and metal. Those are your optimal surfaces. And if you're going to use metal, the best metal to use that we can get easily here is galvalume, which is a zinc aluminum compound, which is very resilient to corrosion. There are all sorts of other benefits that come when you harvest rainwater. Stormwater management. Cities like, actually Calgary is working on it. Victoria has already done it, I believe. They've decoupled, in your sewer bill, they've decoupled stormwater and sewage. And if you have a property that absorbs all the water that falls on it, you don't pay a stormwater fee. And Calgary's going to do that too, because they've recognized it's cheaper to empower homeowners to manage their own rainwater than it is to continually increase the size of storm sewers. The question was that I wouldn't drink the water coming off of a tar shingle roof. Yeah, if you're going to go for the drinking route, I would change the roof material. Yeah.
What about basement storage?
Basement storage? Yeah. Question was, what about basement storage? So my wife's grandmother had a giant cistern in the basement, and it was actually covered in tar. But I think they most used it for their garden. And I think it's great. I think that's one of the best uses of basements, if you've got the right footing underneath the tank to be able to support that mass. What a fantastic place to put water. Absolutely. There's really fantastic pillow tanks. They look like giant, like pillows for giants, basically. And they're inexpensive. And they'll go about 1 meter to 2 meters tall. Sorry, about 1 meter tall by whatever space you've got in your basement. And they should theoretically last forever. The seals are guaranteed for a certain amount of time. You got to make sure that if there is a leak, you've got a mechanism to get rid of it after the fact. But if you're going to build in the crawl space, yeah, why not put one of those pillow tanks underneath there? So the question was, if you've got a tank that is transparent, like those IBC 1,000-liter tanks, should you cover it? Turns out you do not need to cover it. That stuff growing on the inside of the tank is not detrimental to the water quality. The biggest thing with choosing a tank is making sure the plastic is UV stable. And I don't think those are UV stable plastics. So, they're also not big enough. Like our roof, we live in about 1,100 square feet. That's our footprint. We harvest about 30,000 liters of water off of that roof per year. So 1,000 liters is kind of a drop in the bucket. We probably need closer to 5,000 or 6,000 liters to be on. What kind of coating would you use on PVC? So you just go to your paint store, and there'll be a primer and then a final coat that's specific for PVC.
Is ABS all right?
ABS is I don't believe it's UV stable. HDPE is though. But HDPE is harder to work with because you got to use a fusion welder to put it together.
Well, I used it on mine.
Oh, ABS?
Yeah, and I just coated with a high zinc.
Okay. It's probably fine. I mean, it's from a code perspective, anything black, the code will view that as black water. You put it into a black pipe. So I don't think it's rated for potable use, whereas PVC is, even though PVC is toxic. Okay guys, well thanks so much. I'll be up here. My books are $10 cheaper than Amazon if you want to buy one. And I've got a whole box full of them. And I'll be up here to answer any questions or chat with you guys for a little while longer. So thanks guys.